The alarm had been screaming for 72 hours straight, and I was the one they wanted to blame. I stood in a bare gray room on Velcarn station, with 2 armored guards behind me, and a woman named Grace Bennett across the table, her eyes red from 3 sleepless nights. She was the only other human in that room, the station's chief liaison between our small human crew and the Ishtali Dominion that owned this place, and even she was looking at me like I might be hiding something. "Ethan," she said quietly, "the princesses have been missing for 3 days. Every scan says you were the last person near the royal corridor before the cameras lost them. I need you to tell me the truth, right now, because if you don't, the guards outside this room will not be as patient as I am." I told her the truth, because it was all I had. I had walked past the royal corridor on my way to fix a broken coolant line. I had seen nothing. I had heard nothing. And the worst part was, nobody could prove I was lying, but nobody could prove I wasn't either, because human minds do not show up on Ishtali sensors. Their whole security system was built on reading thoughts, and mine was a locked door they could not open. That made me the only blank spot on a station full of eyes, and on a station where 2 little girls had vanished into thin air. A blank spot looked exactly like guilt. Yeshel was 6 years old, Ovrin was 8. They were the youngest daughters of Selai, the matriarch who ruled this station and the world beneath it, and their disappearance had turned every corridor into a war zone of fear. Guards in black armor tore apart cargo holds. Search drones flew through vents no bigger than my arm. The Dominion's telepaths, usually calm and distant, had linked their minds together into one giant net, sweeping every deck twice, 3 times, looking for a spark of a child's thought anywhere on the station. They found nothing, not a whisper. It was as if the 2 girls had simply stopped existing. I was not allowed to leave that gray room for another 6 hours. When they finally let me go, it was only because a new search team had been sent to sweep the lower engineering decks, and Grace needed every human worker accounted for and watched. I walked back to my quarters with 2 guards trailing 3 steps behind me, their armored boots echoing louder than my own, and I felt every eye on the station land on my back at once. My door was already open when I reached it. I had not left it that way. I never left my door open, not on a station where trust was thinner than the air in the vents. My hand went to the frame, and my heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears, because for one terrible second I thought someone had broken in to plant evidence against me, to finish the job of making me the villain in this story. Then I stepped inside and saw them. Yeshel and Ovrin were curled together on my narrow bunk, wrapped in my spare work jacket like a tent, fast asleep. Ovrin's small hand was resting on her little sister's shoulder, and both of their strange violet faces looked calmer than anything I had seen on this station in 3 days. For a moment I simply stood there, afraid that if I moved, I would wake up and find out this was not real. Ovrin stirred first. Her eyes opened, slow and heavy, and she looked at me the way a child looks at someone they trust completely, without fear, without suspicion, as if being found in my room was the safest thing that had happened to her all week. "You found us," she mumbled, her voice thick with sleep. "Good. We were getting hungry." I did not know whether to laugh or cry. Instead, I hit the comm panel on the wall and called it in, my voice shaking as I said the words that would end the longest search in the station's history. Within minutes, my small room was full of armored guards, medics, and Grace Bennett, who pushed past all of them to kneel beside the bunk and check both girls with trembling hands, as if she still could not believe they were really there. The guards wanted to take me away immediately. Finding the missing princesses in my quarters did not look like innocence to them, it looked like proof, and for a few unbearable minutes, I thought I was about to be arrested in front of the very children I had supposedly helped return. It was Ovrin who stopped it. She sat up on the bunk, small and stubborn, and told the guards in a clear, steady voice that if they touched me, she would not say a single word about where she and her sister had been. The room went silent. Even the guards, trained to answer only to the matriarch's word, did not know what to do with a princess giving them an order. Grace used the silence to get everyone out except herself, 2 medics, and the station's head of security, a broad-shouldered Ishtali officer named Torv, who had run the search from the very first hour. Only then did Ovrin tell her story, and it was nothing like anyone expected. 2 nights before they disappeared, Yashel had woken up thirsty in the middle of the sleep cycle and wandered toward the kitchen near the royal wing. On her way back, she passed a closed council chamber where 3 of her mother's own guard captains were speaking in low, careful voices. Being 6 and curious, she pressed her ear to the door instead of walking away. What she heard sent her running straight to her older sister's room instead of to her mother. The captains had been discussing what they called a transition of leadership. They were not talking about an election or a vote. They were talking about removing Soleil from power before the next council meeting, using a moment when her personal guard would be thinned out for a ceremony, and placing one of their own in her place. Yashel did not understand every word, but she understood enough to know that her mother was in danger, and that she did not know who inside the palace she could trust. Ovryn, older and sharper, made a decision that most adults would not have had the courage to make. She knew that every guard, every advisor, every mind on that station could be read by the network of telepaths that protected the royal family, and she had no way of knowing which of those minds belonged to the plotters. Telling anyone meant risking that the wrong person would hear it first. So instead of telling anyone, the 2 girls disappeared into the only place on the entire station that no telepath could reach. Velcarn Station had been built centuries before the current sensor net was installed, and buried deep beneath the newer decks was a maze of old maintenance crawl spaces, sealed off and forgotten, lined with a thick alloy that blocked every scan the Dominion had ever built. Ovryn had found the old access hatch months earlier while exploring, the way bored children do, and she had kept it secret out of nothing more than simple childhood mischief. That secret became the only safe place in the universe for 2 little girls, carrying a secret too dangerous to tell. For 3 days they lived in the dark, crawling through narrow ducts, eating ration bars Ovryn had been quietly stockpiling since she found the hatch, drinking from an old maintenance tap that still worked. They listened to the search from a distance, the vibrations of boots and drones passing just beyond the alloy walls, never quite finding them. But 3 days without proper sleep and warm food is a long time for anyone, let alone 2 children, and by the 3rd night they were exhausted, frightened, and desperate for somewhere safe to close their eyes. That was when Ovryn remembered me. Weeks earlier, I had been repairing a coolant pipe near the royal wing when the 2 girls had wandered past their guards to watch. Most of the station staff either ignored them out of nervousness or fawned over them out of duty, but I had simply talked to them like they were kids, showing them how a pressure valve worked, letting Yashel hold a tool she was far too small for while I kept a careful hand nearby. It was nothing important to me. To them, it was apparently unforgettable, because Ovryn remembered exactly where my quarters were, and she remembered something else too, something the Dominion had never told its own citizens directly. Human minds, she said, felt different to a telepath. Loud, warm, impossible to read clearly, but also impossible to sneak up on without being noticed. To 2 children hiding from an enemy who might be reading every other mind on the station, my quarters were not just familiar, they were the one place in the entire station where a hostile telepath could not simply walk in and read their location from my thoughts before I even knew they were there. They had crawled through an old vent behind my storage locker, one I did not even know existed, slipped into my room while I was on shift, and finally allowed themselves to fall asleep for the first time in 3 days. Torv listened to all of this with his jaw tight and his hands clenched at his sides. He did not doubt Ovryn's story, not for a second, because a child that age could not invent details like ceremony timing and guard rotations. What he needed now was proof, and proof meant moving fast, because if the plotters had noticed that the princesses were found and safe, they would know their plan had likely been overheard, and they would act before anyone could stop them. The ceremony Yeshel had heard mentioned was not some distant event. It was scheduled for the very next morning, a public gathering where Sele would formally open the new trade routes to 3 neighboring systems, standing in the main hall with only a fraction of her usual guard around her, while the rest handled crowd security. It was the perfect moment for 3 armed men she trusted to remove her, quickly and quietly, and announce a transition before anyone outside the room understood what had happened. Grace turned to me, before I had even finished processing what Torv was saying. She asked if I would be willing to help, not because I had any weapon or any training, but because of the one thing that made me valuable in that entire station full of telepaths. My mind could not be read. If the plotters had a way of sensing suspicion building around them through the thoughts of every Ishtali guard on duty, they would never sense it through me, because there was nothing for them to sense. The plan came together in less than an hour, built out of desperation, and the sharp instincts of a security officer who had just spent 3 days failing to protect 2 children and was not about to fail a third time. Torv would quietly replace 2 of the 3 guard captains involved in the plot with loyal officers before the ceremony began, using a routine shift change so nothing looked unusual. Grace would stay close to Sele under the excuse of coordinating human trade logistics, ready to pull her away at the first sign of trouble. And I would carry a small recording device hidden in my tool bag, walking the halls near the ceremony, under the excuse of last-minute maintenance checks, listening for any final conversation among the plotters that could be used as proof once the moment came. Yeshel and Ovrin were moved to a secure medical wing, guarded by officers personally chosen by Torv, men and women he had known for years and trusted with his own life. It was the hardest part of the plan for both girls, being separated from the room and the person that had made them feel safe, but they understood, in the quiet, brave way children sometimes understand things adults struggle to accept, that helping their mother mattered more than their own comfort right now. The next morning arrived too fast and too slow at the same time. I walked the corridors near the main hall with my tool bag over my shoulder, checking valves I had already checked 100 times, my heart hammering every time an armored guard passed close enough to notice me. The ceremony had already begun by the time I reached the service corridor that ran behind the main hall, and through the thin wall, I could hear Soleil's voice, calm and formal, announcing the opening of the new trade routes to a hall full of officials and cameras. It was in that corridor that I heard the 3 captains. They were speaking low and fast, the way people speak when a plan is about to become real, and there is no room left for hesitation. One of them, a captain named Draven, was giving the final signal, telling the other 2 that in exactly 4 minutes, when Sele moved to the ceremonial podium at the center of the hall, her guard rotation would thin out just long enough for them to act. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the recorder trying to hold it steady near the wall vent between us. I did not understand every word of their language, the translator implant in my ear catching most of it a half-second behind, but I understood enough, and I understood the countdown in Draven's voice most of all. I did not wait for 4 minutes. I ran. I burst into the service door beside the main hall, just as Soleil was stepping toward the podium, her guards already beginning to shift positions exactly the way Draven had planned. Grace saw me first, her eyes going wide, and she moved instantly, catching Soleil's arm and pulling her back half a step under the cover of a whispered trade question, buying precious seconds while I shoved the recorder into Torv's hand at the edge of the hall. Torv did not need to hear the whole recording to act. One look at my face, wild and breathless, was enough. He signaled the loyal guards he had placed earlier that morning, and within seconds, Draven and his 2 co-conspirators were surrounded, their weapons taken before a single shot could be fired, their faces caught between shock and the slow, sinking realization that somehow, impossibly, they had been discovered before they could move. The hall erupted into confusion, officials shouting, cameras capturing chaos instead of ceremony, but at the center of it all, Soleil stood untouched, her eyes moving from the captured captains to Grace, to Torv, and finally to me, standing there out of breath in the middle of a royal ceremony, with a tool bag still hanging off my shoulder. She did not say anything to me in that moment. There was too much happening, too many guards to secure, too many questions to answer. But later that evening, after Draven and the others had been taken into custody, and the station had finally, truly gone quiet for the first time in 4 days, Sele came to the medical wing where her daughters were waiting, and she did not go to them first. She came to me. She told me, through a translator that struggled to keep up with the weight in her voice, that her own guards, her own trusted network of minds she could read like open books, had almost cost her everything, while a stranger, whose thoughts she could not touch, had saved her life twice in the same week, once by being a safe place for her daughters to hide, and once by being the only voice in that corridor loud enough to warn the people who could stop it in time. Yeshel and Ovrin were allowed to leave the medical wing that night. The first place they asked to go was my quarters, just to sit on the bunk again, just to know it was still there, still safe, still mine to offer them, whenever the universe felt too big and too dangerous for two little girls to face alone. Word of what happened spread across the station faster than any official announcement could manage. Humans, who had been tolerated as cheap labor and quietly distrusted for the one thing that made us different, the one blank spot no telepath could fill, were suddenly being looked at differently in every corridor I walked. Not because we were stronger, or smarter, or more skilled than anyone else on that station, because when it mattered most, being unreadable had not made me dangerous. It had made me safe, in a way nothing else on that entire station could be. I still fix coolant pipes for a living. I still keep my head down most days, and I still do not fully understand half of what the Ishtali say in their own language. But every now and then, when my shift ends, and I walk back through the quiet corridors toward my quarters, I find two small violet faces waiting outside my door, tired from a long day of lessons and duties they never asked for, simply wanting somewhere quiet to sit for a while. I always let them in,